Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Kramer with MRC-TV. Today we're speaking with Devin Westhill, President and General Counsel for the Center of Equal Opportunity, to discuss the American Bar Association and their new mandate. Devin, thank you for coming on to talk with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So the American Bar Association made a recent decision to mandate diversity training and affirmative action. What drove to this decision, and is this a violation of academic freedom or federal law?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons that might have driven this decision. I should say that these are only proposed recommendations right now. We still need to wait until next year to find out whether or not the American Bar Association will actually implement these proposals. That'll happen in February 2022. But one of the reasons I think is that right now we're seeing a push in a lot of institutions to implement some diversity, equity, and inclusion measures, and the American Bar Association is one of those that feels like they need to be on board as well, make sure that law schools are getting on board with this idea. Now, I think it could be violative of a lot of issues, right, including First Amendment issues. If this is going to, as a lot of people have suggested so far, legal scholars, create some sort of viewpoint discrimination against individuals who might dissent to whatever the training or education on racism, cross-cultural competency, and equity is going to be provided through law schools as a result of this ABA potential requirement. But there are other issues as well. I mean, some of them are just practical issues. So many scholars have been concerned that there's a lot of vagueness and imprecision in these recommendations as well. So what exactly is equity? What is cross-cultural competency? And how are schools going to comply with this? None of that is defined in the current recommendations. And so this puts a really serious burden on schools who could lose their accreditation if they don't implement these proposals that they're go through.
Yes. So like you said, this is under consideration. The American Bar Association is considering making all law schools accredited with them, which is a lot. Quote, provide education to law students on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism. Like you said, cross-cultural competency isn't really defined. I wanted to ask you, is this a woke agenda, or is this fairly reasonable? Does this mean that you have to pass a specific diversity training course in order to become a lawyer?
That's a good question. I think there's a reasonable disagreement right now over what this actually is doing. There are individuals who are concerned that this is a part of a larger agenda, the woke agenda, perhaps, as you suggest. But there are other folks who are serious thinkers and very thoughtful and are indicating that diversity, equity, inclusion efforts are on the whole potentially beneficial, but the way in which the ABA is going about trying to implement these measures is wrong, is going to be confusing, and also potentially going to harm the harmony that otherwise would be on law school campuses with, for example, affinity groups that are by definition non-diverse. And so I think there are serious considerations about and thoughts that are floating around out there about how this can actually be improved. But of course, there are a lot of scholars and folks who are thinking, well, there's more to this, and we really need to be careful about implementing things that could look like critical race theory in our law schools. That's pretty scary. If
this does become mandated, do you foresee legal institutions being transformed into machines of social justice?
Well, my personal opinion is that higher education is pretty far down that road already, and that we ought to try to figure out how we can rein in that social justice sort of freight train already. I think this is another way in which you might be able to sneak some of that wokeness, some of that critical race theory, some of that really divisive ideas into higher education, which really doesn't need it anymore. And so, like a lot of other people, I'm concerned about this proposal as well. And I really do hope that as the ABA subcommittee that's considering this has done already, sideline some of these standards proposals. It did that for its diversity, inclusion, and equity proposal just because it got such pushback, and there's concern over what exactly the implications would be of creating, for example, effective actions that could lead to progress in diversity? Do we really want that, for example, at historically black colleges and universities? Does that mean that they, for example, need to recruit more white students for their campuses? Is that what we're trying to do with this? It's all very confusing right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, the ABA obviously thinks that the law is racist, wanting students to, quote, fight racism in the law. Do you agree? Is the law racist?
Well, I personally don't think that this country is racist. I don't think that we're institutionally racist or structurally racist or whatever vague term we want to use for racism these days. But I do think that there are ways in which we can improve everything in this country, including higher education, including law school. But I do think there's a real concern about this idea that there's an obligation in the legal community to work to eliminate racism, particularly in the legal profession, as these standards would require. There's no such obligation that exists. And so there's concern about what exactly that particular ABA standard is trying to do here. Is it trying to establish that obligation? If that's the case, we're going to have to get much more serious and thoughtful and precise about what we mean by having that obligation, because currently there's no such obligation that exists.
Yes. Well, the American Bar Association has a stranglehold on each state's judicial bar and state regulations regarding who can practice law. And of course, most of the schools accept this government money. How does the ABA have this much power over law schools and the law?
Well, I mean, the ABA has just had this monopoly over accrediting law schools for a long period of time. The bottom line is, they've got that power. Are they here abusing that power, that accreditation power? I've seen scholars argue that as well. The jury's out for me on whether or not they're doing that. I certainly think that they're trying to, by having these notice and comment periods where folks can write in and voice their concerns and help to narrowly tailor these standards changes, that they're trying to do their best to make sure that they're balancing both the desire for diversity, equity, and inclusion measures on law school campuses, but also making sure that they're doing it in a way that's circumspect and, again, thoughtful and serious.
Yeah. And last question, Yale Law School, which is notably very left-wing, many of their faculty have come out against this. Why do you think that is?
Again, I think it's because those are serious scholars. There are people who are really thinking about the implications of an incredibly broad, but at the same time, vague and imprecise standards. The legal profession, our job is to make sure that we're as precise and accurate and clear as possible when we write, when we speak, and when the ABA is producing something that is just, muddled in so many ways, it's not surprising that you have, now these are very obviously eminent scholars, but even left-wing or left of center scholars who come out and say, wait a second, go back to the drawing board. We need to do better here. We may agree with the end result, that we should have more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive campuses, but this is not the right way to do it. We have to do it in a way that folks are put on notice, what's required of them, what these things mean, and before we launch something like this. So I think that's the reason. They are just like any other lawyer. They're looking at this and they're reading it critically, and they think there's problems with it. And I agree with them.
Wow. Well, I appreciate your expertise on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you.